That's right. Luke was recommending a video to Bob on the subject because somebody had put all the information together. But I guess he's forgotten about that video since then.
I must have. I'm not sure which video you're thinking of. That was a year ago. Okay, here I wrote a little article. This is what you guys are talking about when Paul says I rebuked Peter to his face.
Yes.
Yeah, I've got a few different church fathers here. We've got, let's see here. I'll read the section, but I've got who? I've got Tertullian talking about it. I've got Origen talking about it. I've got Irenaeus talking about it. All right, those should be enough. We'll read what I wrote here. This is something I
There's
wrote.
also Chrysostom.
Oh, yeah. I'll grab Chrysostom. In fact, I've got him here. We'll read his last.
Yeah, do his last, but
All
his
right.
is also good.
All right, don't let me forget. Okay, we're just discussing the issue then of when in Galatians when Paul opposed Peter to his face, what exactly was happening there? And was Peter teaching heresy? I've heard some wicked people suggest such thing. Okay, this is what I wrote like a year ago in this little article. I said, "Friends, the apostle Peter was being sensitive to the Jews who had been under the law of Moses for 2000 years by following the old covenant law whenever he was around them, so that he would avoid offending them and have a chance to preach to them. He didn't intend on keeping aloof from Gentile converts forever, but only for a short time. He didn't teach a false doctrine, but only acted a certain way when the Jews were around. Peter was thankful when Paul came and backed him up. Peter was afraid of losing converts if he didn't coddle the Jews. He never taught all Gentiles must be avoided. For goodness sake, it says in the same text that he was eating with Gentile converts. In Acts 10, Peter made it clear he understood that God had made the Gentiles clean to associate with. As he says, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him, and yet God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean." So you know Peter understood this, that everyone is welcome to him, as he later says. I most certainly understand that all people are welcome to him, any man who fears God and works righteousness. And Paul also coddled the Jews in order to win them to the faith. He didn't teach that anyone was required to be circumcised or offer animal sacrifices in the new covenant, but he performed those things to avoid offending the Jews, which James told him was permissible. This is Acts 21:17. Luke says about his travels with Paul. He says, "After we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly, and the following day Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. And after he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God. And they said to him, 'You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And they've been told about you that you're teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then is to be done? They'll certainly hear that you have come. Therefore do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. And by the way, that's something they would do if after they were finished with a vow. And we will know that, and all will know that there's nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication." Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, he went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification, until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. So, guys, we can see is, I mean, Paul is doing even more than what Peter is doing when you think about it. The fact that he is paying the expenses for them to perform a sacrifice. I mean, what's more extreme? Offering sacrifices after the old covenant has been abolished, or just not eating with a Gentile? I mean, sacrifices is pretty much more extreme, I would say. And then there's Acts 16. It says, "Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. And he was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted this man to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that his father was a Greek." So again, guys, this is even way more extreme than what Peter did. Peter's just keeping aloof from the Gentiles when the Jews are coming over. But Paul offered sacrifices, or at least he paid the expenses for sacrifices, and he circumcised a man. And yet, does this mean Paul was actually convinced we all still need to keep the law? No, of course not. Paul and Peter were in perfect agreement on this, but each of them were condescending to the Jews whenever the Jewish believers were present, because the Jews again had been practicing the law for 2,000 years. So they were convinced that they had to. They were convinced it would be a sin if they didn't. And Paul and Peter knew that. In fact, Peter related very much, Paul related very much. They also had been deeply entrenched in that mindset. So they were going to be patient with the Jews, especially these believing Jews who are confessing Christ as their Lord. And they're going to help them very gradually to come out of this mindset and to understand the meaning of the law and to understand it was fulfilled. And again, I wrote here, does anybody have any idea how much Paul hated circumcision? Do you think he wanted to circumcise Timothy? This is how Paul feels about circumcision. He says, "Behold, I, Paul, say to you, that if you receive circumcision, Christ will be of no benefit to you. And I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law. You have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace." So that's how Paul feels about circumcision. Now, is Paul saying that Timothy has been severed from grace? No. It's only if a person wants to be justified by the law that they're severed from grace. So Paul did that physical act, but both he and Timothy understood the law, that it had been fulfilled, and they only did that act to try to appear righteous in the Jews' sight, because the Jews would not even associate with them, wouldn't even let them come in the temple to teach them, the synagogue, unless they were circumcised. But Paul's not being inconsistent. Both Paul and Peter taught the true doctrine, but they acted in obedience to the law of Moses when trying to win Jewish converts. By the way, the law of Moses is not heresy. If what a crazy thing to say. Oh, Peter is teaching heresy. That's what I heard somebody say. I think it was back when people were new to the server. They're saying, yeah, Peter used to teach heresy. That is crazy, guys. The law of Moses is not heresy, but it is a law that we understand to have been fulfilled, so we no longer need to keep it. Yes, as I said here, the law has been replaced by the new covenant law. You should all be able to see the difference between the apostles doing something in condescension to weak-minded people, people who have weak consciences, who think they're still under the old law given by God, compared to someone teaching a heresy. Yes, and again, Paul says this in Romans 14:13. This is very consistent. This is 14 through 15. He says, "Therefore, let us not judge one another any more, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. I know and am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but to him who thinks anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. For if because of food your brother is hurt, you're no longer walking according to love. Do not destroy with your food him for whom Christ died." And again he says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law." Okay, that should be quite clear, but let's hear Tertullian as well. He's going to talk about this event. He says, "Now with the view of branding the apostles with some mark of ignorance, they, the heretics, they put forth the case of Peter, and them that were with him, having been rebuked by Paul. Something, therefore, they say, was wanting in them." In other words, the heretics are saying, well, the only way that would have happened that Peter got rebuked was if Peter's ignorant about some things. This they allege in order that they may from this construct that other position of theirs, that a fuller knowledge may possibly have come afterwards over the apostles, such as fell to the share of Paul when he rebuked those who preceded him. This is what the heretics are saying. They're saying, fuller knowledge came in over time. And of course, that's false. He says, "Still, they should show from the circumstance which they allege of Peter's being rebuked by Paul, that Paul added yet another form of the gospel besides that which Peter and the rest had previously set forth. But the fact is, having been converted from a persecutor to a preacher, he is introduced as one of the brethren to brethren, by brethren. To them indeed, by men who had put on faith from the apostles' hands. Afterwards, as he himself narrates, he went up to Jerusalem for the purpose of seeing Peter, because of his office, no doubt, and by right of a common belief and preaching. Now they certainly would not have been surprised at his having become a preacher instead of a persecutor, if his preaching were of something contrary, nor moreover would they have glorified the Lord, because Paul had presented himself as an adversary to him. They accordingly, so in other words, he's saying, come on, why in the world would they be receiving Paul as their brother if Paul were preaching a contrary gospel? That doesn't make any sense. Obviously, they're in agreement. They accordingly even gave him the right hand of fellowship as a sign of their agreement with him, and arranged amongst themselves a distribution of office, not a diversity of gospel, so that they should severally preach not a different gospel, but the same to different persons. Peter to the circumcision, and Paul to the Gentiles. For as much then as Peter was rebuked, because after he had lived with the Gentiles, he proceeded to separate himself from their company out of respect for persons, the fault surely was one of conversation, not of preaching. So he's saying the only fault was of who Peter was conversing with. And Peter was not conversing with the Gentile converts when the Jewish converts were coming over. He was doing this in order to not offend. And as John Chrysostom points out, Nolan is right, we should totally quote that. John Chrysostom thinks that Peter was actually happy when Paul did it. He's like, yes, say it, Paul. Yes, say it. Why are we still trying to put these Gentile converts under the law? Yes, yes, preach it, Paul, because they just will not. They're just not going to accept it from me. They resist it. So yeah, I tend to think the same thing. That when Paul showed up, Peter was not upset. He liked having Paul come up there and say, "Hey, Peter, we don't need to be doing that." He's like, "Yep, yep, yep. I'm in agreement. I know." Anyway, here's Origen. He says, the first book of our answer to the treatise of Celsus, entitled A True Discourse, which concluded with the representation of the Jew addressing Jesus, having now extended to a sufficient length, we intend to present part as a reply to the charges brought by him against those who have been converted from Judaism to Christianity. As we call attention, in the first place, to this special question, that is, why Celsus, when he had once resolved upon the introduction of individuals upon the stage of his book, did not represent the Jew as addressing the converts from heathenism rather than from Judaism, seeing that his discourse, if directed to us, would have appeared more likely to produce an impression. This is a very specific situation. Maybe I'll skip to the red part I saved here. Anyway, he says, he's talking about Peter meeting Cornelius. He says, Peter went up into the upper room to pray about the 6th hour, and he became very hungry, and would have eaten, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance, and saw heaven open, and a certain vessel descending unto him, as it had been a great sheet knit at the 4 corners, and let down to the earth, wherein were all manner of 4-footed beasts, and creeping things of the earth, and fowls of the air. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And the voice spake unto him again the second time, What God has cleansed, that no longer call common. Now observe how by this instance Peter is represented as still observing the Jewish customs respecting clean and unclean animals. And from the narrative that follows, it is manifest that he, as being yet a Jew, and living according to their traditions, and despising those who were beyond the pale of Judaism, stood in need of a vision to lead him to communicate to Cornelius, who was not an Israelite according to the flesh, and to those who were with him, the word of faith. Moreover, in the epistle to the Galatians, Paul states that Peter, still from fear of the Jews, ceased upon the arrival of James to eat with the Gentiles, and separated himself from them, fearing them that were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews and Barnabas also followed the same course. And certainly it was quite consistent that those should not abstain from the observance of Jewish usages who were sent to minister to the circumcision, when they who seemed to be pillars gave the right hand of fellowship to Paul and Barnabas, in order that, while devoting themselves to the circumcision, the latter might preach to the Gentiles. And why do I mention that they who preached to the circumcision withdrew and separated themselves from the heathen, when even Paul himself became as a Jew to the Jews, that he might gain the Jews? You guys see how Origen agrees with what I was just saying there? He says, why are we surprised to find that those who, that he would separate himself, withdraw himself, and separate himself from the heathen or the Gentile. That's what the word heathen and Gentile are the same. When even Paul himself became as a Jew to the Jews, that he might gain the Jews. So he's saying, Origen is saying both Paul and Peter are acting the same way. Wherefore also in the Acts of the Apostles it is related that he even brought an offering to the altar that he might satisfy the Jews that he was no apostate from the law. Yep, that's Origen's commentary. And then here's Irenaeus. He also speaks of it. Maybe I'll just read the red part. I can post the whole thing though if you guys want to read it.
Yeah, you should definitely post this to the website.
All right. So this is again going over the same story of Cornelius. He says, "And therefore did he exclaim, Can any man forbid water, that these should not be baptized who have received the Holy Ghost as well as we? He persuaded at the same time those that were with him, and pointed out that unless the Holy Ghost had rested upon them, there might have been someone who would have raised objections to their baptism. And the apostles who were with James allowed the Gentiles to act freely, yielding us up to the Spirit of God. But they themselves, while knowing the same God, continued in the ancient observances. So that even Peter, fearing also lest he might incur their reproof, that just means being rebuked by them, although formerly eating with the Gentiles, because of the vision and of the Spirit who had rested upon them, yet when certain persons came from James, withdrew himself, and did not eat with them. And Paul said that Barnabas likewise did the same thing. Thus did the apostles, whom the Lord made witnesses of every action and of every doctrine, for upon all occasions do we find Peter and James and John present with them, scrupulously act according to the dispensation of the Mosaic law, showing that it was from one and the same God, which they certainly never would have done, as I have already said, if they had learned from the Lord that there existed another Father besides him who appointed the dispensation of the law." So he's saying they were all in agreement to preach differently to the Jews, to be patient with them, and to be sensitive to their weak conscience that said, no, we've got to keep following this law. But again, they were not preaching a different gospel, but only going along with the carnal following of the letter of the law with those Jewish converts, even though they knew what it meant that some animals were unclean or that the heathen were unclean. They knew what that symbolized. You guys got to understand, we're talking about a practice that the Jews had for 2,000 years. Can you imagine if the churches had had a single practice from the time of the apostles until now? I mean, for 2,000 years. Imagine if there was no deviation in the churches. But, like, imagine if the church was unified and just always did the same thing. Like, think of a bunch of practices and just never stopped for 2,000 years. And imagine after 2,000 years trying to get them to stop doing that. That's how difficult it was. Is a major, major, challenge. And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect or to observe the apostles doing that. It's not unreasonable to see that they would act that way in insensitivity to the Jews who were so used to doing this from all their ancient practice, from all their ancestors. Okay, but where's the one from Chrysostom? Let's see if we can pull it up here. I enjoy the Chrysostom explanation. Let's see here. Homilies on the Acts. Good grave. We've got a lot from Chrysostom. Which one are we thinking of, Nolan?
His Galatians homily.
Here we go. Might it be this? Well, here's Galatians and Ephesians.
Nope.
No, that's Ephesians.
No, sir.
All
That's
right.
Ephesians.
Okay, hold on a second.
We need Galatians.
Here we go. Is this it?
Might be this one. It's on Katina, I know.
All right, you want to jump over to Katina? They got a big long
Sure.
section.
They got the whole thing there, just to tell you the truth. If you go to that section in Galatians and Katina, it will be there.
What was it?
What part of Galatians you mean?
2, 7 through 9. Let's see how massive this section is. No, that's not very massive. Let's see here. So 1 minute. These are short sections. Alright, we'll just start with 7. What does he say? He says, some hold the meaning to be not only that the apostles did not instruct him, but that they were instructed by him. Let's see, what is he talking about? I'm not seeing it in that one, Nolan. Wait, is this right? Galatians 2?
Is it proper to say they were acting? You're correct, Preston, because it's the same. Well, we'll get into that, but it's the same word being used. It's part of the reason that this wouldn't have been such a foreign thought, because when it talks about Peter being, a hypocrite, this is the word for actor.
That's
So he was
exactly.
acting.
Well, you must have read it then, Preston, if you're asking that, because that's what Chrysostom says. He says, I don't even think they were really being serious. I don't think when Paul rebuked Peter that he was seriously rebuking him as if he thought Peter didn't understand this, but he was giving the speech for the sake of the Jews, and that Peter was happily receiving that so-called rebuke from Paul so that the Jews could hear it, and they could hear like their master Peter being rebuked, and they'd be like, wow, and Peter's accepting the rebuke, like, Peter, you shouldn't be acting like that. You know that the law is fulfilled, and they could see their master yielding to it. And they'd say, "Wow, if Peter, our teacher, is so humble that he accepts a rebuke about this, then we all will be humble too." That's essentially what Chrysostom says. But we've got to find the quote. But I don't know, Nolan. I don't know where it is.
Why did you not go to Galatians 2:11 in the Catena?
Oh, that's a good point. I'm going to jump over to it right now.
You can read either one.
Here we
There's
go.
2 and
Here we
3.
go. All right.
They're like the same.
Here we go. This is a nice lengthy section. This is it. All right, we'll read this one first. Chrysostom says, he says, many of those who read this passage of the letter superficially believe that, okay, I'm sorry. He says, many of those who read this passage of the letter superficially believe that Paul rebuked the hypocrisy of Peter, but it is not so. It is not so. Far from it. For we shall find that there was here a deep, though hidden understanding between Paul and Peter for the good of those who listen. How could one who risked his life before such a multitude have ever played the hypocrite? Paul does not now say this to condemn Peter, but in the same spirit as when he said those who are reputed to be something, he now says this too. The apostles, as I said before, consented to circumcision in Jerusalem, because it was not possible to tear them away from the law all at once. But when they came to Antioch, they did not henceforth observe anything of the kind, but lived indifferently with believers of Gentile origin. Peter also did this. But when people came from Judea and saw him preaching there in this way, he gave up this practice, fearing to disturb them, and changed his ways. He had a twofold purpose: to avoid scandalizing the Jews, and to give Paul a plausible reason to confront him. For if Peter himself, having included circumcision in his preaching in Jerusalem, had changed in Antioch, those of Jewish origin would have surmised that he did this from fear of Paul, and his disciples would have condemned his excessive complaisance. And so Paul rebukes, and Peter voluntarily gives way. It is like the master who, when upbraided, or when, criticized, when somebody finds fault with him, when the master keeps silent, so that his disciples might more easily change their ways. So that's basically what I said, right? I was trying to summarize. That's how Chrysostom takes it, and I think that's very reasonable. Based on what we know about Peter and Paul, that they were pillars. They were full of all wisdom at this point. He says, many on a superficial reading. Maybe I'll read a little farther. Yeah, that was like the abbreviated version. Do I want the
Yeah.
abbreviated version?
No, the second one is it's like the same thing but translated a little bit differently.
Well, I think it's just not so cut out. There were a lot of dots in there. Okay, this is the full version. He says, many on a superficial reading of this part of the epistle, they suppose that Peter accused, or Paul accused Peter of hypocrisy. But this is not so. Indeed, it is not so. Far from it. We shall discover great wisdom, both of Paul and Peter, concealed herein for the benefit of their hearers. But first, a word must be said about Peter's freedom in speech and how it was ever his way to outstrip the other disciples.
That's that
Indeed,
parhesia, by the way.
yes, being bold.
Freedom of speech. Yes,
This is,
bold speech, frank speech.
yes, Peter was known to be very bold, like when he said, don't say such things anymore, Jesus, and I'll die with you. Even if I have to die, I'll never deny you. Peter was always the first one to speak up. You are the Christ, the Son of God. That's what Peter's known for. He says, Chrysostom is pointing this out. He's saying, remember, guys, remember Peter's personality. He says, indeed, it was upon one such occasion that he gained his name from the unbending and impregnable character of his faith. For when all were interrogated in common, he stepped before the others and answered, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This was when the keys of heaven were committed to him. So too he appears to have been the only speaker on the mount. And when Christ spoke of his crucifixion and the others kept silence, he said, Be it far from you. These words evince, if not a cautious temper, at least a fervent love. And in all instances we find him more vehement than the others, and rushing forward into danger. So when Christ was seen on the beach, and the others were pushing the boat in, he was too impatient to wait for its coming to land. And after the resurrection, when the Jews were murderous and maddened, and sought to tear the apostles in pieces, he first dared to come forward, and to declare that the crucified was taken up into heaven. It is a greater thing to open a closed door and to commence an action than to be free spoken afterwards. How could he ever dissemble who had exposed his life to such a populace? And the word dissemble means to conceal your true motives. So he's saying he doesn't think Peter would have been a coward toward these Jews. He's like, look at how brave Peter is. Look at how outspoken Peter is. He says, He who, when scourged and bound, would not bate a jot of his courage, and this at the beginning of his mission, and in the heart of the chief city where there was so much danger, how could he, long afterwards in Antioch, where no danger was at hand, and his character had received luster from the testimony of his actions, feel any apprehension of the believing Jews? You understand John's argument here? He's saying this is years later. This is when Peter has even experienced much more persecution. He's even been whipped by the Jewish priests, or by their men. He's saying that was when they were in Jerusalem, and he was brave. He's not even in any danger in Jerusalem. He's in Antioch. And John Chrysostom is saying, so don't think that Peter was actually a coward or afraid of these Jewish believers. They even believe in Christ. Like, why would Peter be afraid of those guys? But what Peter is afraid of is of them being caused to stumble, of them falling away, and thinking that they were part of a sect that was just attacking the law of Moses and neglecting to obey it when they ought to. Anyway, John Chrysostom says, How could he, I say, who at the very first and in their chief city feared not the Jews, while Jews, after a long time in a foreign city, feared those of them who had been converted? Paul therefore does not speak this against Peter, but with the same meaning in which he said, For they who are reputed to be somewhat, whatever they were, it makes no matter to me. But to remove any doubt on this point, we must unfold the reason of these expressions. The apostles, as I said before, permitted circumcision at Jerusalem, an abrupt severance from the law not being practicable. But when they came to Antioch, they no longer continued this observance, but lived indiscriminately with the believing Gentiles, which thing Peter also was at that time doing. But when some came from Jerusalem, who had heard the doctrine he delivered there, he no longer did so, fearing to perplex them. But he changed his course, with two objects secretly in view, both to avoid offending those Jews — by the way, guys, offend means cause them to stumble — and to give Paul a reasonable pretext for rebuking him. For had he, having allowed circumcision when preaching at Jerusalem, changed his course at Antioch, His conduct would have appeared to those Jews to proceed from fear of Paul, and his disciples would have condemned his excess of pliancy, meaning just being too pliable, being too easily influenced by Paul. And this would have created no small offense. But in Paul, who was well acquainted with all the facts, his withdrawal would have raised no such suspicion as knowing the intention with which he acted. Wherefore, Paul rebukes, and Peter submits, that when the master is blamed, yet keeps silence, the disciples may more readily come over. Without this occurrence, Paul's exhortation would have had little effect, but the occasion hereby afforded of delivering a severe reproof impressed Peter's disciples with a lively fear. Had Peter disputed Paul's sentence, he might justly have been blamed as upsetting the plan. But now that the one reproves and the other keeps silence, the Jewish party are filled with serious alarm, and this is why he used Peter so severely. Observe, too, Paul's careful choice of expressions, whereby he points out to the discerning that he uses them in pursuance of the plan, and not from anger. His words are, "When Cephas came to Antioch, I resisted him to the face, because he stood condemned, that is, not by me, but by others." Had he himself condemned him, he would not have shrunk from saying so. And the words, "I resisted him to the face," imply a scheme, for had their discussion been real, they would not have rebuked each other in the presence of the disciples, for it would have been a great stumbling block to them. See, that's a very interesting point, guys. Chrysostom is pointing out that if Paul were legitimately upset at Peter, then he would have he would have understood, if I am rebuking Peter in front of everybody, this is going to create what looks like a big schism in the church. And the way that they would actually do it is they would privately talk to each other if there was an issue. But he's saying, no, Paul doesn't do that. Paul does a public rebuke because he understands that Peter is perfectly aware of this. But he's doing it for the sake of the listeners, and they're both cooperating in what John Chrysostom is calling the plan. He says, "But now this apparent contest was much to their advantage. As Paul had yielded to the apostles at Jerusalem, so in turn they yield to him at Antioch. The cause of censure or criticism, the cause of censure is this: for before that certain men came from James, who was the teacher at Jerusalem. He did not eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing them that were of the circumcision. His cause of fear was not of his own danger, for if he feared not in the beginning, much less would he do so then. But he feared their defection," meaning he feared them falling away. As Paul himself says to the Galatians, "I am afraid of you, lest by any means I have bestowed labor upon you in vain." And again he says, "I fear, lest by any means, as the serpent tricked Eve, so your minds should be corrupted." Thus the fear of death they knew not, but the fear lest their disciples should perish agitated their inmost soul. Everybody understand what Chrysostom said here? Hopefully. So long story short then, Chrysostom is saying everybody understood, both Peter and Paul understood, that the Jews needed to be condescended to, but that when Paul showed up, Paul did a rebuke of Peter in the presence of those Jews who were still practicing the law, and in Peter's presence, who was practicing the law of not eating with Gentiles. And Peter was happy that Paul was doing this rebuke, this public rebuke, because then he could say, "You're right, Paul. We should not be doing that. We should just be consistent." And the Jews, rather than just even Peter and Paul doing it together, like, "Hey guys, quit doing that," they would feel like they're under attack. The Jews would be too defensive. So John Chrysostom is saying, with a lot of confidence, he thinks that rather than rebuking the Jews themselves, it would be more expedient for Paul to rebuke Peter and make it seem as if Peter was going to allow himself to be corrected in this way and stop being bad, stop being overly condescending to the Jews. And by seeing Peter humbly receive that correction, say, "Yes, you're right, we need to stop doing that," then that would humble the Jews, and the Jews would follow their humble teacher, Peter. Make sense to everybody? It would be easier
Yeah,
for
I
the
have a question.
Jews to humble themselves if they see even Peter humbling himself. There are examples I could I could make about this of how this might be done in regular life. But yes, Isaiah, what was your question?
So at first, like when you were starting to explain it in the beginning, I thought it was like, Paul he rebuked Peter, even though you showed examples of Paul doing stuff to condescend to the Jews, and Peter was also doing things to condescend to the Jews as well. I thought Paul was like actually rebuking Peter because in his case he was like, being aloof from the Gentiles when he was with the Jews. So that's why they would defer, even though they're both trying to condescend to the Jews. Like Peter was wrong in, not fellowshipping or whatever with the Gentiles, but it seems like it wasn't even that. But he was just doing like a kind of fake rebuke because Peter and Paul both knew, but it was solely for the sake of those Jews, and Paul didn't really think that Peter done anything wrong.
Right, because Paul was
Okay.
doing the same thing. Paul privately, well, in his own time, I mean, he was doing the same thing, offering a sacrifice or even circumcising, despite how much he hates circumcision. Paul says,
All
"I'm
right, yeah,
I'm
that
not
makes
going to eat
sense.
I'm not going to eat meat around a Jew because the Jew will stumble and think I'm committing sin."
Yeah.
So if Paul will even abstain from eating the foods and will do the sacrifice and will circumcise, that's way more extreme than what Peter was doing, just not eating with somebody. So you understand they're on the same page, they're doing the same thing, but when they're together, they took advantage of that opportunity since Peter clearly was, caught in the act of separating from the Gentiles when the Jews showed up. Paul said, "This is a great opportunity. I can see that Peter's doing the same thing I'm doing, but I'm going to call him out in front of everybody. And Peter, I know, will respond accordingly. I'm going to say, 'You're right. I'm going to stop doing that.'" And everybody, all the Jews are going to say, "Oh, let's follow our humble example in Peter."
No, yeah, that all makes sense. Like now I know that Paul didn't actually think that Peter did something wrong. I mean, of course, that like they shouldn't have been doing it like that because that's why he said something, but he didn't think that Peter actually did something wrong. Whereas, like that's what I thought at first, but that makes sense. And when it says, I think I must have thought because I haven't read it in a minute, but when it said Cephas, I thought that was just talking about like some other dude named Peter, but like how a whole bunch of people have the same name, so they would distinguish like, Mary Magdalene and whatnot. But it's talking about like the same Peter, so yeah,
Most
that's
likely.
interesting.
There was an old theory, but this is by, you don't have anybody until 300s that says this. It was Eusebius, as far as I'm aware, that was the first one to say this. But he does say in church history that he believed that it was a different Cephas than the Peter that most people think of.
But he did
Do
say
you
it
remember
for,
him saying that?
yes, but he said it for the same reason. He said, "I don't think Peter would ever," he gave the same reasons that Chrysostom gives. He doesn't think Peter would be so cowardly and be so afraid of the Jews that he would be doing this, out of fear that the Jews are going to catch him or something. He thinks that doesn't sound like Peter. So he actually is in agreement that Peter would not be doing that, but he comes up with an alternate explanation saying, well, maybe this is a different Cephas. Maybe it's not our Cephas. And we obviously we don't agree with that. We don't think that's true. But still, we give Eusebius credit. He is saying the same thing. And actually, Nolan, Eusebius points to Clement of Alexandria in a book that we don't have from Clement of Alexandria, and he says Clement of Alexandria first made the suggestion because Clement of Alexandria said
That's right.
Peter is not a coward. Peter is not afraid of the Jews. Peter was whipped brutally by the Jews. Peter went on big mission trips just like the others. He was happy to be killed if necessary. So he wasn't afraid of some Jew getting upset at him, especially in a place where there wasn't even any persecution. They were in Antioch. So, yes, they're in agreement. But, yes, in that case, Eusebius and Clement of Alexandria are actually suggesting an alternate explanation, the same spirit, same idea that Peter and Paul are actually not in disagreement, but suggesting an alternate explanation that it might be a different Peter. But yeah, we all take the majority view that it is the real Peter, but just that Peter and Paul have an agreement.
Yeah, because I never knew he had like Cephas in his name. I thought all it was Simon Peter. Wait, so was Clement of Alexandria? He was just saying like, this is something else that people can think, and I see why they think it, or was that like what his actual theory was, that it was a different
This is
Peter?
theory.
Yeah, that was his belief.
Oh, wait, so why? How come he would have believed that? Because wouldn't it have been handed down from tradition that it was our Peter?
No, because when the apostles are teaching their disciples, they are not just opening their letters and saying, "All right, sit down with this letter here. I want to show you what I meant by every word, every sentence." When we tell you that the apostles taught their disciples and that the authority that they gave them is very powerful because they were so thoroughly instructed, we're saying they were taught all the doctrines of Christ. They weren't necessarily taught every little sentence what they meant by every sentence in their writings. So there are there are things that the church fathers could come away with. Their explanation of what the apostles meant by what they said, that isn't based on a commentary they heard from an apostle, but from knowing the apostle themselves. And in this case, yeah, you don't need no we're not saying the church fathers necessarily got a commentary on every verse of the apostles, but that they understand the apostles' doctrines very intimately. And so they would understand the letters much better, being so close to the apostles.
No, yeah, that part makes sense. It's not like they showed them the letter or what they said and then broke everything down, but they could have been like, oh, for some parts, this is what I meant when I said this, or they intimately knew how they taught their doctrine, so they would have a way better understanding of it than we would.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I still don't get the part because it's like I know there are some people, and it's not a big deal, but like there are some people who had to have known, okay, this is talking about Simon Peter, like the like our Peter, the apostle, and people knew that, and it was handed down, and then they could have told Clement of Alexandria that and been like, like your theory is valid, but that's not really what it is. But I don't know. I don't quite understand, but it's nothing like major, obviously.
Yeah,
Well,
I
like
don't.
for example, Paul had actually spent time with the Galatians and teaching the Galatians, and it wasn't until this letter that he even told them about this story. Like it's entirely possible that they never even knew about this occurrence with Paul
It
until he told them about it in the
exactly. This
letter.
was not necessarily some massive event. The only reason Paul brings it up is because he's trying to get them to understand they don't need to be following the law according to the letter. But this little event, I mean, can you imagine how many interactions Paul had with Peter and how many events they had throughout their lives over many years? You guys know Peter was in Rome for like 12 years. Do you guys know what he did while he was in
Yeah.
Rome? Nobody knows. For 12 years, can you imagine how many things he did like every day? That's thousands of days. And we don't know anything. So I'm sure these are amazing things that happened on all those days. We got a tiny little snippet, a tiny little window into something that happened on one day during Paul's trip to Antioch. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily something that any apostle stressed when explaining. But what they did stress was the fulfillment of the law and explaining how the law is fulfilled, even if they didn't describe all their little interactions with the Jews who were struggling to abandon, let go of the letter of the law.
Mm, okay. Yeah, I guess I was thinking that like, since it's in the scriptures, that this was something that was not like a major major topic, but that pretty much everyone talked about. But I guess like that wasn't the case because there was much greater things. And then also maybe I had like in the back of my mind that most church fathers read like all of the scriptures, like all the letters and stuff, but it wasn't as widely accessible back then how we have it today. So that makes sense why he would come up with a theory like that.
My point is just that you could theoretically you could be a direct disciple of one of the apostles for years and never have heard this story.
Hmm.
Like Paul just never mentions it to you.
And by the way,
Yeah.
I want you to know the theory that Clement of Alexandria came up with. It's not a like just a patently false theory. When we say that we don't think it's correct, we're not saying it's made up from scratch. It's just that Clement was taking some knowledge he had, like you could say two pieces of information, and using them to corroborate, well, using them to explain a difficult passage in Scripture, which is a passage that appears to show two apostles having a conflict and not even any explanation of the resolution. You just assume Peter relents and stops practicing the so-called hypocrisy, the play acting. But there are two pieces of information. The first one is that Peter is a Christian. He is completely wise. He is complete in all of his understanding of the doctrines of the faith. You could say another piece of information is that he's not a coward. He's the boldest of all the apostles. That just doesn't jive well with him, the idea of him being afraid. But there's this third piece of information I'll present to you real quick here. I'm going to share screens again. This is a book by Hippolytus, or they're not sure. They aren't absolutely certain it's Hippolytus, but again, they do that with a lot of books by the church fathers. Hippolytus gave a list of all the 70 disciples who were sent out by Jesus, and in this list, he mentions a Cephas, one of the 70, who is separate from Peter. So this is a third piece of information Clement of Alexandria would have, that there actually was another disciple, one of the 70, named Cephas. He's saying it's possible. He's just suggesting, it is possible that it is this Cephas. But again, we know that Clement's heart is in the right place. He is defending the honor and the dignity of Peter, who was the greatest of the apostles and perfectly complete in all wisdom. And he's saying, I don't think Peter was actually ignorant about anything. And he's doing that to defend the apostles against the heretics who make such ridiculous accusations and say all the apostles are foolish. They still need to learn a lot of things. We know that that's false. We know that Paul, who was doing the rebuking, was condescending to the Jews in the same way that Peter was.
I feel as
Okay.
if there's I feel as if there's people out there who will um, quote this passage to disregard what was oh my goodness, bro. My mind, never mind. My mind just flopped on me, Luke. Ah,
It's
never
okay,
mind.
bro. But
Disregard the unanimous teaching of the church, authority of the
well,
apostles,
if they can
kind of like that.
attack the apostles, how much more can they attack the early church fathers? If they can even use verses in the scriptures to prove that the apostles were deficient in their understanding, how much more can they disregard the fathers?
Yeah. Well, Luke, thank you for that explanation. Oh, dang, no one left. Thank you for that explanation. It makes sense now. I understand like how Clement of Alexandria, like, oh, how would he even come to that opinion? But like, it makes sense now. And and yeah, so thank you.
You're welcome.
And did you save the Chrysostom quotes?
Oh yeah,
Nice, nice.
I'll make a little document.
Oh, how'd the call with the David Berceau people go?
I will read it for, or I'll upload it for you.
Okay. Dang, it's 8:30 already? That's crazy. It's like, so it's gonna be 11 over there for y'all.
Yeah.
Yeah, one sec.
No, it's about 10:30 for him, Isaiah.
Oh no, yeah, I know it's 10:30 over there, but I was saying like, it's getting close to 11.
It's midday for my sleep schedule.
What time is it in New York? That's where you're at, right?
Yeah, it's 11:30. It's about to be 12 a.m. soon.
Dang, it's late, and I gotta go to school tomorrow. But thankfully, it's a short day, or not like a half day, but with the way that the schedule is, get out my last class an hour early for X block, and then we got a 4-day weekend.
That's how it used to be for me.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there
Oh, I
some
can't
holiday
wait.
coming up?
Somewhat.
Is there a holiday coming up that there's a 4-day weekend?
I think it's Monday's President's Day, and then this Friday, it's not because of Valentine's Day, but there is something to why we have the day off. Maybe it's a staff day. I don't know.
Okay.
Hey, no complaints here. We can take off Thursday too. I ain't tripping. All I know is over the 4-day weekend is that I'm finna finish um what is it called? Justin Martyr's first apology. I'm gonna
Mm,
make sure I finish that because I need to keep up on my reading pace, you know?
got you. Uh, Oh, Luke. So when you sent that message in the general, did anyone DM you or no
Which message?
about
Oh, yes.
yeah.
When you guys were coming?
Yeah, like you were saying, like, oh, you're taking a head count.
Nope, nobody did. Nobody's coming. No, I think only a couple people did.
Gotcha. Okay. I was just seeing if there's anyone I need to add to this chat, but it looks like this is everyone safe for Xavier if he's able to get the confirmation, and I don't know what's happening with Jeremiah. Alrighty.
Yeah, let's reach out to
Yo, Luke.
Jeremiah. When is he gonna respond?
I don't know. I've been trying to message him for like the past week now. I haven't gotten a response. I don't know. I don't know what's happening. I'm just assuming he's busy because he moved fairly recently.
Or he died.
I know Mikey's been talking with him, like semi recently, so I know he's alive. I believe. No, it's John or Nathan. There we go.
Hey, Luke. Are you
Oh, hey
finna
there.
leave soon, or you're gonna stay for a little?
Yeah, I'm skedaddling. Unless you have anything you
Dang.
wanted to talk about.
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't have any questions. You know, I mean, shoot, we can come up with some questions. We'll keep you here. We know
Mm-hmm.
you're not answering our questions, but I was gonna be like, since it's kind of quiet, if you wanted to quiz us
Oh
on
man,
just whatever.
my brain is too unquizzable. Unquizzing. I was so prepared. I was so prepared for a big discussion with those boys, and I think my brain received far more stimulation and engagement from preparing than having the actual discussion.
What did you like? You like didn't do well in the debate, or?
Oh no, no, it was just there was no debate. It was just so lame.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you mean. I was like, nah, did they make him look stupid or something? I'm like, nah, there's no way.
I
He must
wish
mean
I
that it
wish
was
they'd
just
I wish they'd
uneventful.
come out with guns blazing, and I wish they'd had some information, but it was as disappointing as a discussion could possibly be, and they need to do better. And we need to find somebody who will have this discussion with me because I need to. I mean, don't you guys want it? Don't you want me to be opposed by somebody and make the case? And don't you want to hear the best defenders against female modesty make their case?
Yes, 100%.
How about you get a Protestant female pastor?
Ooh,
There
no,
you go.
that's
I'm
torturous.
just
Yeah.
kidding. I'm just kidding.
I want somebody who upholds the early church tradition, and the only person that's going to do that is either somebody from some Anabaptist background or Orthodox background. So most likely, someone who follows Berceau or somebody who claims to revere the early church. So
They
maybe
not
I'd be
Brian,
ready. They don't want the smoke.
yeah, maybe Adam. That'd be nice if we could get Adam.
I
Somebody
don't.
who calls us insane, but there's no response.
I'd be interested if it was on a different topic. I think I've heard enough about veiling for my lifetime.
I feel the same way, Kevon. But still, I feel the same way. But it's just plug your ears, Kevon. No, it's important. because they're gonna call us insane. I mean, then prove it. If we're insane, it should be easy to disprove. I want to be disproven. I want them to come at me. Oh, we'll get the chance later.
Luke can he can like refute any heretic like in his sleep about the veil. And he'll find quotes from the 3025s, the 1800s.
3,000. From the
Uh-huh.
future?
He'll he'll pray to God
Bro,
and ask for quotes from the future or something. Hey, look, this is all
citations from the
scary.
future. It's
I
crazy.
know. I know.
Now
Yeah.
that's well researched.
All right.
Uh-huh. The meanings of all the words, all the collupto variations, he got it on lock.
Okay. All right. I'm going to bed.
All right, good night, Luke. Thank you.
Farewell. Good night, everybody. God be with you.
God bless.